This presentation, entitled Integrated Risk Assessment and Digitization, comes to us from Craig D'Souza. Craig is the Managing Director of eRisk 360 and is a governance, risk management, and compliance professional with training across ISO management system assurance and certification. He is registered with Exemplar Global as a lead auditor in management systems, including quality, EMS, and OH&S. Craig's main areas of focus is in providing integrated risk management consulting, auditing, and training solutions across these areas, focusing on quality, environmental, and occupational health and safety risks. He has worked with startups as well as across small, medium, and large global private and publicly listed high-growth ASX traded companies. In addition, he has worked at both the state and national levels of the Australian government. And with that, take it away, Craig.
Thanks for the introduction, Mike. As Mike mentioned, the topic for today is integrated risk assessment and digitization. And my name is Craig D'Souza, and thanks for the opportunity for speaking at the Online Auditor Expo. By way of background, eRisk 360 is a Melbourne-based company. We specialize in governance, risk management, and compliance. We have a particular focus on helping companies develop integrated ISO management systems in compliance with quality, health and safety, and environmental management system standards. So today's presentation will go for around 30 minutes or so. And I hope that you get some fundamental knowledge around how to develop an integrated risk assessment. And this is primarily focused on environmental and health and safety risks. We'll go through some of the key factors of what it means to be successful in developing an integrated risk assessment. And then I'll talk about some key technology enablers and what are some of the fundamentals behind these technology enablers and how can they be used to help and drive the performance and risk management process across an organization. I don't expect a lot of assumed knowledge in this course. Some basic knowledge of the standards would be helpful, in particular, how to develop aspects and impact registers. But I will go through an example during this presentation that will help you practically implement the risk assessment process within your organization. And this session is designed for people from across all industries with varying level of knowledge and experience. Again, this is a basic overview of the session. The focus will really be on the integrated risk assessment framework and the process and the actual assessment methodologies that we use to evaluate the risks. And I'll be giving you an example of a warehouse used for the assembly and storage of goods, and we'll take you through an example of that and how to assess risks. So what are some of the challenges? So typically we find when doing an audit, maybe an internal or an external audit, we find that there's a limited awareness and understanding of risks within that organization. The definitions and the frameworks used are actually quite inconsistent. There isn't a common understanding. A lot of the systems lack maturity. The risk assessments are by and large incomplete. They're partially developed and they lack the full implementation. So whilst there's been a lot of time at the start developing the system, it's basically been neglected and the organization has failed to really fully implement the requirements of the standard. So what we're really left with is an organization that's highly reactive. So there's potential for things to go wrong. And we also are left with a system that can be by and large quite complex because you get various people coming in at different times with their own understanding inconsistent sort of language around risk and that process of identifying risks and evaluating risks, it becomes far too complex. So these are the typical sort of challenges we see. In terms of what the definition of integrated risk management is, this is from Gartner, and they've defined risk management as being a set of practices and processes supported by a risk-aware culture and enabling technologies that improve decision-making and performance. And there's 6 key or unique traits behind the risk management process, and that's around strategy, it's around assessment, it's around your response or your mitigation measures, it's about the way the organization communicates and reports their risk, then it's that continual monitoring, and it's also around the technology that they use, which is also an important enabler, as I mentioned before, which we will touch on during the end part of this presentation. I've highlighted number 2, which is the assessment process, which is also one of the key learning outcomes of this presentation, where we'll go through that assessment process and what it means to actually assess risks and how to identify and assess these risks using a proven methodology. So what are the benefits of integrated risk assessment? There are a number of benefits. The main benefit is to look at the system as a whole. You can still categorize risks into various categories like health and safety or environmental or quality, but basically you want to be able to intrinsically link your system together within the one integrated system. So you're looking for risks and categorizing risks separately, but at the same time you have one register that captures all these risks. So you can improve your efficiency, standardize some of your processes, and it also offers the opportunity to engage the organization and build some capabilities for professionals that have skills across a variety of areas. It could be things like cybersecurity, it could be health and safety, it could be business continuity, or it could be as well as combining those skills in environment and health and safety and quality. So it's all about building that integrative capability within the organization. So one of the key aspects in understanding risk is really to identify what the company actually does, how it operates, what are some of the activities and processes, and actually understand that organization. And that stems from understanding its vision, its mission, its values, and also ultimately what its objectives are. So before you go ahead and start assessing risks, it's super critical to understand the organization. The greatest value also in understanding an organization is to actually conduct some visits. So for example, it could be observing the company in operation. It also could be undertaking various interviews or discussions with various staff in the organization. So these are various aspects of gathering information so you can understand an organization. So in the warehouse example, a good way to understand what actually happens is not just to interview staff or read policies and manuals and what they do on the website, but also physically observe during various stages of operation. And you'd see that diagram on the right there, which is figure 1 in ISO 9001. It shows a diagram of how some of the important elements within understanding an organization based on inputs and outputs. So in the warehousing context, it could be goods received. The activities would be the packaging of goods or the assembly of goods. And then the outputs would be final export or delivery of those goods to a customer site. And again, some of those inputs could also be in maintaining the conditions of the warehouse. It needs to have appropriate lighting and needs to have appropriate heating and cooling. So that's a good way to flowchart your existing activities so you can understand your business before you jump to the risk assessment process. And again here, I've talking about the scope of the management system. That's very important. We are only identifying risks that are relevant to the scope of the organization. So in the example of a warehouse used for storage, we're not really interested in risks associated during the construction of that warehouse, or the manufacture or design of particular goods. We're only really limited to talking about the scope within that particular warehouse. So it's really just warehousing and storage, and not any other activities that would be considered external to that organization. As I mentioned, things like construction or manufacture and design of goods. So it's important to understand your scope as well. So moving right along, it's important to have a really clear understanding of risk and that definition. And I really like the risk definition used in ISO 31000, the risk management standard. It's simple, it's very easy to remember and understand, and it's basically defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And there's both downside risks and upside risks. So you get downside risks, which are usually negative risks, threat-based risks, and they typically interfere with objectives. And you get the upside risks, which are positive risks, and they usually support objectives. I won't spend too much of time on this slide, but effectively, these are some of the key principles and processes and frameworks that have been identified in ISO 31000, the risk management standard, and it really provides a useful framework for talking about risk. These frameworks and principles are used by a number of organizations, both public, private, government, not-for-profit, and across a variety of industries. So they're really well-accepted guidance documents that outline some of the key principles and frameworks and processes for managing risks. So the key focus is integrated risk assessment, and it's important to really get an overlay of the start to finish, so the end-to-end process and what you really need to do each and every step of the way. So while I'll be focusing on number 4, which is how to assess the risks, it's important to not just plan, but it's also important to understand, prepare, assess, and then report. So when we plan, it's important to spend the time, the appropriate amount of time in planning your risk, your integrated risk assessment. So agree on what your objectives are, your scope, select the risk assessment team, develop a project plan. So it's important to spend the time planning, and then also understand it. It's about gathering the appropriate information. I find that it's always best to observe and witness activities during operations. You can really pick up a lot of information in observing and witnessing. But of course, you also look at other data sources and other data inputs into this risk assessment process. And then there's the assessment preparation phase. You develop your structure, you determine what methodology you'll use, how you grade your risks. Then you actually physically conduct your risk assessment, where you actually have a template. Typically, people use Excel spreadsheets. Now, a lot of these things are also digitized, which I'm going to talk about later as well. And the assessment process is where you identify gaps, you review your risk assessment, you consult, make sure there's a common identification of these risks, you finalize your risk assessment. It's really important that you don't rush this particular stage. You don't want to miss key information. You want to be data-driven and not emotion-led. So that's really important, and we'll go through some examples on that. And then finally, you want to report on that risk. That's when you draft your risk report, depending on who your audience is. If it's senior executive or board level, you want to make sure you review it within a workshop, try and get some consensus around what you're putting forward. Important to engage your stakeholders here in this process as well, right throughout the process, in fact, actually. And then finally, you publish your report. So that's an overview of the process, and we'll be talking specifically about the assessment part. So moving right along here, the methodology used for integrated risk assessment. This is a well-accepted risk assessment methodology. You might have seen this table before. It can be used for both health and safety and environmental risks. It talks about the likelihood, that's on the top. And the likelihood is how often the activity is likely to happen and result in a particular consequence. And these consequences can be both health and safety related, or they can be environmentally related, but a consequence typically is defined as how bad the result of that activity actually is. So for health and safety, you can see here the consequence number 1 is a fatality. And that could be, a gas explosion in a power plant, could result in a fatality. 2 is a lost time injury greater than 7 days. So that could be, a serious type of injury. Then you've got 3, which is still a lost time injury, but less severe. Then you've got 4, which is an MTI. They call that a medical treatment. And 5, which is first aid. And on the other hand, consequences for environmental risks. A really serious consequence for an environmental risk could be permanent release of toxic materials. And number 2 could be long-term effects. A consequence of number 3 could be just moderate impact or reversible effects. And number 4 could be a minor short-term effects. And a consequence of number 5 could be a reversible low impact environmental consequence. And then you basically assess your risks based on likelihood and consequence, and then you read the scale and you come up with a particular risk number, and what that number falls in equates to whether or not it's a high risk, a medium risk, or a low risk. So this is one particular option, and it's a fairly simple 2-dimensional assessment. So 2-dimensional meaning it's just based on likelihood and consequence. Another method here to evaluate risk is a 3-dimensional assessment. It's based on threat, vulnerability, and impact. It's a little bit more complex, but it's possibly more accurate because there's 3 dimensions to measuring risk. And it's just another assessment methodology. Which method you choose is purely dependent on what the organization feels most comfortable with. So in this example, again, there's a rating scale from 1 to 3. And there's basically the approach is a multiplication of all those 3 particular downside risks. So risk is the threat times the vulnerability times the impact, and a threat is a negatively affect objectives. So for example, with flooding, a threat effect could be the increased frequency of flooding. The vulnerability is conditions that allow an event to occur. So in the case of flooding, that could be poor control, such as no drainage, or potentially being in close proximity to a flood-prone area. And then the impact is the effect that the event has on objectives. And this is highly contextual. So for example, in the case of flooding, it could be major evacuation or injury, or it could also be asset damage. And effectively, you categorize your risk based on low, moderate, or high. and then you multiply those numbers out to get a particular risk rating. Again, there's no rules in terms of what methodology you use. It's what the organization is most comfortable with. Okay, so I'm going to jump to some examples now. And the example that we are using here is a warehouse used for the assembly and storage of goods. And we're going to look at health and safety risks first, and then we're going to look at environmental risks second. But we're going to use the first method, the two-dimensional risk assessment method. So you'll see I've set up here an aspect and impact type register. I've identified the activity. So the first activity here is incoming goods and parts received. The aspect here is a forklift strikes personnel. You've got the impact being lost time injury due to hospitalization. And that was determined by understanding or assessing what the likelihood is, which is a C, it could happen, and the consequence is long-term effect. So if you look at C2, we get a number of 18, and that 18 falls into the high risk category. Then you've got the second activity, which is manual assembly of plant and or equipment. So this is assembling various parts. The aspect could be the employee manually lifting heavy plant, and the impact could be a back injury or a particular kind of strain, and we've got the impact being medical treatment due to a sprain in this instance. Again, the likelihood is could happen, and the consequence is a moderate impact. So we look at C3, and C3 gives us a risk rating of 13, which is a medium risk. So it's important to recognize that these particular risks or these particular activities are the result prior to when we've implemented any controls. We're just really at the risk assessment process here. We haven't implemented any controls, and you'd expect once controls are implemented that these risks would or would potentially be reduced. So this is an example of health and safety. The final activity here is walking within the warehouse. It's a much lower risk, as you can see. So that's the first method, which is the two-dimensional risk assessment method. This slide here, same example in a warehouse, but we're looking at environmental risks now. And whilst I've sort of separated both health and safety and environment, you can look at color coding some of these activities. So if the impact is an environmental risk, you can look at color coding this into a particular color code, or it's really up to you how you want to integrate this register. But what I'm really suggesting is when you go around and you do your interviews, you do your observations, you gather your data, you're looking at providing risks in the one fully integrated system that captures both health and safety and environmental risks. And you're using the same methodology, using the same approach to actually evaluate these risks. So again here, I'll just go through the first one of storing of chemical resins within the factory. There is an aspect here that of chemical spillage might result in an overflow into drains, and this would impact pollution of the waterways via the stormwater system. Likelihood is not likely to happen, and the consequence is a long-term impact if it was to happen. And for it being not likely to happen, it could be because they don't store a lot of resins. It's not a product that comes in a lot. It's a product that's stored outside or a separate area that's bundled. So there could be a number of reasons what that D, not likelihood rating, could be a number of reasons why that level was given to that particular activity. And then you've got some other common type activities and some common impacts around most sort of warehouses. So hopefully this approach, again, the key take-home message here is that you want to have a consistent way of identifying and evaluating and categorizing some of these risks. So what are some of the key factors of integrated risk assessment success? So I've summarized them there. It's important to consult with the organization. You want to have a level of consistency and standardization when assessing risks. So you want that common definition. As I mentioned before, have a common definition, have a common methodology, have a common framework. Make sure everyone is speaking the same language, basically. Dot point number one. You don't want to rush that risk assessment process. Make sure you plan it out, and make sure you spend the required time to actually validate some of your reasoning behind how you've allocated and how you've assessed those risks. And you also want to engage the entire organization, or at least engage people from all levels within the organization, so that ultimately everyone is going to take ownership and responsibility. So you, as the risk leader or the compliance person, you want to ultimately be in a position where you can influence or you can create some kind of change, or if there is particular areas or particular bottlenecks that need to change, then you want to make sure that you do engage people so that you bring them along that journey towards understanding their needs and understanding what the change is that's required to bring about those improvements. So it is all about reducing that ambiguity and improving that level of consistency and standardization. So now I'm going to be talking about digitization. This is a whole body of work here that's being done in digitization. If you really are really interested in it, I suggest you look at some of the work that Gartner has done in this area. They've done a lot of useful papers and research and peer reviews into various sort of digital products that are out there. And there's some really interesting information. And yeah, please feel free to contact me if you have any further information in terms of how or why digitization can be used to improve some of the benefits of risk assessment. But effectively, what we're really doing is we're converting a lot of that physical information. So things that is contained in documents and spreadsheets, what we really want to do is move that into a digital format. And effectively, we're doing that by moving it into the cloud. So simply put, it's delivering powerful computing services to the way you manage your systems and your processes. And we've seen a massive influx in software tools that are available to facilitate risk assessment processes. As these software tools are certainly an enabler and can provide a number of distinct advantages when compared to doing things manually. As I mentioned, moving away from documentation, moving away from, physical documentation, moving away from your Excel spreadsheets and moving it into the cloud. There's a lot less opportunity to make errors in the way you input data as well. But there are things that you need to be aware of when you're making decisions around purchasing or procuring new technology enablers in this space that will help you with your risk assessments. So I'm not saying that we should get rid of Excel spreadsheets and we should, all move to the cloud and use some fancy sort of software. But what I am saying is that there's some distinct benefits and advantages that can be captured in using these enablers, because what they are is they are technology enablers, and they can help to improve things like inclusiveness and the ability to collaborate and manage stakeholders. And they can be very powerful mechanisms to get that level of change within the organization that you need. And I've listed some benefits here on the right-hand side of the slide. Things like, for example, getting legal updates. We know in Victoria there's going to be a new environmental legislation coming out in a couple of months' time. Having access or being able to have a system that can provide continuous updates is something that would be really beneficial for a lot of organizations in being able to get that information in real time, delivered in real time. If there are any, for example, with the Environmental Protection Act and updates in this particular domain, can save organizations a lot of time. With your incident reporting and management, with your non-conformance reporting, the ability to get that data and information, the ability to quickly summarize your reports, and as I mentioned, also the ability to engage the rest of the organization via various means like notifications and tracking. So I guess in summary here is we should be aware of the tools and the trends that are happening in this space and what's actually available, so what is best. But obviously this can only benefit you if you specifically know what the need of the organization is, which sort of leads me to my next slide. And that's, if you are interested in digitization, there's a lot of information here. You can go onto my blog site here. It's a bit of a resource, and it basically provides some suggestions on what you need to look for when you're looking at digitizing. If you're looking at technology enablers, what are some of the key things that you as an organization, you as a risk and compliance professional, or as a leader within your business needs to look at? And it all starts with understanding your needs, understanding the organizational needs, both the functional and the non-functional needs. And then there's a list of other factors that I've listed on this particular slide. I won't go into the detail of it because if there is further information that you require, please refer to my blog, or I'm more than happy to take any questions on this in more detail at any time. Look, I'd like to conclude by saying thanks. Thanks for listening. Please feel free to contact me for further information. I really hope that you've learned about risk assessments, and I've provided you with some useful tools and methodologies that you can use and practically implement within your organizations and help improve that risk or that integrated risk assessment process. So this brings us to the end of the presentation. Thanks for your time, and really appreciate you watching today. Thanks.
Thank you, Craig D'Souza, for that presentation on integrated risk assessment and digitization within the auditing function. And that concludes this presentation.